Imagine this scene. You're walking through the ancient streets of Rome in 67 AD when suddenly a sight freezes your breath. Nero, the most powerful emperor, the man who controls the lives of millions, is strolling alongside a stunning woman, adorned in priceless jewels. But as you take a closer look, you're struck by a horrifying truth you can barely comprehend. This isn't a woman at all. It's a boy, Sporus. In a fit of madness, Nero has turned this young boy into his wife, not with words, but with brutal surgeries that transformed Sporus into a replica of his late wife, Poppaea. To satisfy his delusions, Nero made Sporus a living doll, a puppet with no identity of his own, existing solely to fulfill his twisted fantasies. This isn't just a story about power, this is a total annihilation of humanity, where Sporus was stripped of everything, from his body to his soul, simply to please a mad emperor. Sporus's story is a chilling nightmare you'll never forget. Before Nero encountered Sporus, he was not the monster people often imagine, a ruthless creature driven by passions and delusions. In fact, when he ascended to the throne in 54 AD, Nero was a promising young ruler. Coming to power at just 16, he was expected to usher in a golden age for the Roman Empire. During his early reign, he implemented many positive policies, lowering taxes, funding public entertainment, and even participating in theatrical performances himself, earning the admiration of the people. But absolute power can change a person in unimaginable ways. As Nero entered the early years of his reign, he not only faced plots and betrayals from high-ranking officials in the court, but he also began to feel the crushing loneliness that power brings. He was the only person in the vast empire of 60 million who could not be contradicted. No one could say no to him. The sense of isolation and the constant threat from those seeking to seize his position began to erode Nero's mind, making him increasingly paranoid and vulnerable. The death of his mother, Agrippina, was a pivotal event in Nero's life. Their relationship had always been tumultuous, with Agrippina suspected of trying to reclaim power and manipulate Nero. After killing her, Nero began to spiral into a vortex of guilt, suspicion, and loss. But this was only the beginning of his downfall. What truly caused Nero to lose his sanity and descend into brutality was the death of his beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was not only a beautiful woman, but also someone Nero believed could share his grand dreams, the only one who could understand his soul and ambitions. When Poppaea died in 65, possibly due to an uncontrolled rage from Nero, it shattered his mind completely. Nero lost not just a wife, but his sanity and restraint, and it was at this point that he began to search for a mad way to bring Poppaea back to life, and Sporus, a boy who resembled Poppaea, became the solution Nero found. Nero's love for Poppaea Sabina was not a normal love. It was an obsession, a madness entirely devoid of reason. When Nero first met Poppaea, he was captivated by her breathtaking beauty. But what truly drew him in was not just her appearance, but her confidence, strength of character, and political ambition. She was nothing like Nero's previous wife, Octavia, whom he married purely for political reasons. Poppaea was completely different, a strong, seductive, and determined woman who was unafraid to display her power in the imperial court. The relationship between Nero and Poppaea began as a typical Roman scandal, an affair, but it quickly grew into something far deeper and more dangerous. Nero didn't simply love Poppaea, he became obsessed to the point where he could not bear the thought of losing her. Poppaea became the center of all his thoughts and actions. Every time she appeared, Nero felt like the world around him disappeared. Those around him noticed the change in his behavior. He became extremely possessive, controlling, and at times violent toward anyone he perceived as a threat to his relationship with Poppaea. Nero's madness was most apparent in how he treated Poppaea in their daily life. He didn't just monitor her every move, he began to intervene in every aspect of her life. Nero set up a network of guards around her, not out of concern for her safety, but because he could not tolerate the thought of her interacting with anyone else. He even went so far as to shower her with lavish gifts, priceless jewels, and elaborate clothing, all ways for him to display his ownership of her. Their relationship was not just an intense love affair, but a relentless control over Poppaea. Nero loved her in a way that stripped her of her independence, seeing her not as a person, but as an object to satisfy his desires. He didn't just want her by his side, he wanted her to embody his fantasies of power, perfection, and immortality. But this excessive love ultimately turned Nero into a terrible husband, as he never allowed Poppaea the freedom to be herself, to have space or independence. And then, when this obsession reached its peak, Nero didn't just love Poppaea, he began to own her in the most brutal and pathological ways. His actions in the years that followed were not acts of affection, but behaviors of control, manipulation, and imprisonment. This would ultimately lead to an inevitable tragedy, as Nero's love was no longer love, but a maddening obsession, and it was the beginning of the devastation that Sporus would later endure. When Poppaea Sabina died in 65 AD, Nero didn't just lose a wife he loved, albeit in a possessive and obsessive way, but he lost a part of himself. Her death was a devastating emotional blow to Nero, plunging his mind into chaos and despair. For Nero, Poppaea wasn't just a wife, she symbolized the perfection, strength, and power he had always desired. When she died, everything Nero had built in his mind about a glorious empire and eternal love collapsed. Nero fell into a deep, overwhelming grief, unable to accept this loss. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated according to Roman customs. Instead, he ordered her body to be embalmed and placed in a grand tomb, larger than those of previous emperors. Nero even built a temple in her honor, declaring her divine, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she were still alive. This scene wasn't just the sorrow of a man losing love, but the madness of someone who couldn't bear the loss of his own delusions. But this grief didn't last long, and in his extreme madness, Nero began searching for a crazy solution to restore what he had lost. For him, Poppaea's death wasn't the end, but a gap that needed to be filled. In a world where everything could be bought, even life and death, Nero sought a way to bring Poppaea back. Sporus, a young boy serving in the palace, became the object of this mad pursuit. When Nero first saw Sporus, the boy's appearance eerily resembled Poppaea, especially his eyes and facial structure. With a mind completely unhinged and unable to distinguish reality from fantasy, Nero saw Sporus as a way to resurrect his lost wife. He decided that, although Sporus was male, nothing could stop him from transforming him into a replica of Poppaea. Nero ordered the palace's doctors to perform surgery to make Sporus into the perfect version of his wife, regardless of the pain and dangers the boy would endure. With boundless cruelty, Nero turned Sporus into a tool to satisfy his mad obsession, hoping that once Sporus became Poppaea, it would heal the wounds in his soul and restore the love he had lost. But this act wasn't just a physical violation. It was a total erasure of a person's identity and humanity. Sporus, once an ordinary boy, was thrust into a life he could not escape, solely to fulfill the madness of an emperor unable to cope with the pain of loss. When Nero decided to turn Sporus into his wife, it wasn't just a change in appearance, but a cruel and irreversible act. It all began when Nero realized that Sporus, a young boy serving in the palace, bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea, especially in his eyes and delicate facial structure. At that moment, in Nero's broken mind, the grief and madness of losing his wife transformed into a perverse fantasy. If Poppaea couldn't come back, then Sporus would be her replacement. Nero's decision wasn't a spur-of-the-moment impulse, it was a meticulous plan to turn Sporus into a perfect replica of his deceased wife. First, Nero ordered the palace's doctors to perform surgery on Sporus, completely altering his appearance to resemble Poppaea. This was no ordinary surgery. It was a brutal and dangerous process that could have killed Sporus. The doctors had to do horrific things to change the boy's body, from softening his facial features to reshaping his body to match that of a woman. Once the surgery was completed, Sporus didn't just look like a woman. He had to live like one in Nero's world. Scholars and servants in the palace began to train Sporus on how to walk, sit, and behave like a woman in Roman society. He had to learn makeup techniques, how to style his hair, and how to wear luxurious clothes. Every day, Sporus faced painful and torturous lessons, not only in appearance, but also in how to live as Nero's wife, until he became an almost indistinguishable version of Poppaea. Sporus was not only changed physically, but also had to lose his own identity. He had to remember every detail of Poppaea, her memories, her stories, her actions in the past. Nero demanded that Sporus continue to play the role of his wife in every situation, from banquets to formal ceremonies. He had to pretend as if he were Poppaea, the wife he had lost, living in the illusion that Nero created. Sporus's life became an endless performance, where he had to pretend to be someone he wasn't. From the smallest actions to his way of speaking, everything was part of the play Nero wrote for him. Sporus lost not only his identity, but also had to live with a role he never chose. He was no longer a free human being, but a decorative object, a living doll, existing only to satisfy Nero's twisted fantasies. Even though he lived in suffering and humiliation, Sporus had no choice. He couldn't fight Nero or escape from what had been decided for him. His life became a daily act, where everything was controlled and manipulated, all for Nero's delusions. When Nero decided to marry Sporus, the wedding was not just a formal ceremony, but a terrifying and haunting event. From the moment Sporus was transformed into the image of Poppaea, everything was set for a royal wedding no one could have imagined. Nero, in his madness, wanted this wedding to be not just ordinary, but a symbol of total power and ownership. He wasn't just marrying Sporus, he was marrying the wife he had lost. The wedding was held with grandeur, in a lavish setting adorned with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Every detail was meticulously prepared, from the bride's attire, which was Sporus, to the extravagant gifts presented to the emperor. Even though Sporus had no choice in the matter, he had to wear elaborate dresses, apply makeup, and pose like a woman throughout the ceremony. Nero ordered the court officials and guests to attend the ceremony and behave as if this was a normal royal wedding. Everyone present had to accept and maintain the lie, even though those who attended must have surely recognized the horror behind it. The congratulations, the expensive gifts, and the applause were all offered to the couple, while in reality, this was a gruesome spectacle where a young boy was forced to play the role of a deceased woman, simply to satisfy the emperor's twisted desires. This wedding was not just a display of power, it was a manifestation of Nero's cruelty and perversion. For him, marrying Sporus was not just a psychological act, but a way to preserve the illusion of Poppaea. Everything in the wedding had no meaning in terms of love or affection. It was a manipulation, a total control over a human being. Sporus was not the bride in this ceremony. He was an object, a possession for Nero to recreate the memories he had lost. And when the ceremony ended, Sporus was not just Nero's wife in the eyes of the public. He became a living machine, forced to maintain an image and role he never wanted. He had to live with this new identity, playing Poppaea in every situation, while he himself had lost everything. This grotesque wedding was not just a humiliation for Sporus, but a testament to the brutality and depravity of an emperor who turned a human being into a tool to serve his delusions. Sporus's life after the wedding with Nero was nothing short of a psychological hell, where every day he faced the erasure of his identity and invisible pains he could not escape. Although Nero had transformed him into a woman in every way, Sporus could not stop being himself, a young boy torn between a changed body and a mind that still belonged to someone else. Every day, Sporus lived in a play he did not choose, forced to embody an image that wasn't his own. He had to remember every detail about Poppaea, her memories, her actions, the words she spoke in the past, and respond to them as if they were his own, even though he had never experienced those events. If Nero mentioned shared memories with Poppaea, Sporus had to respond as if they were his memories too, even though, in reality, he knew nothing about them. Every conversation, every glance from Nero was a test, a constant surveillance. Any mistake, no matter how small, could lead to death. Sporus not only lost his personal freedom, but had to endure daily brainwashing lessons. Nero's servants taught him how to walk, sit, and speak like a woman, using a soft voice and graceful gestures. Every action had to be flawless, no room for error, and every step was controlled. He had to live in a facade, unable to be himself, unable to find any freedom in his body and mind. Sporus, despite playing the role of Poppaea in every situation, could never find peace in his soul. He clearly felt the complete erasure of his identity. Every time he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw himself but a stranger's face, someone entirely different. The luxurious dresses, the heavy makeup, didn't just conceal his appearance. They concealed the very essence of who he was. He was no longer Sporus. He was a reflection of a woman he could never be. As the days passed, Sporus grew increasingly withdrawn and isolated. He couldn't find comfort from anyone. Those around him saw him only as a living decoration, a tool for Nero's games and fantasies. The feeling of being forced into a role he could never escape, unable to show weakness, to cry or resist, made him increasingly desperate. Sporus's life wasn't just a physical torment, it was an ongoing mental torture. The loneliness, the mental suffering he endured every day was an unimaginable ordeal. He was no longer himself, he was merely a shadow, a living machine for Nero's twisted desires. Despite living in the grandeur of the palace, Sporus was really living in an invisible prison, one with no freedom, no love, and no redemption. Sporus's journey of suffering was not just a series of physical pains, but also a never-ending psychological battle. From the moment he was transformed into Nero's wife, Sporus had to endure not only the emperor's delusions, but also the mockery and contempt of those around him. Although Nero treated him like a possession, a living decoration, Sporus's life was not confined to royal feasts or public events, but also to a terrifying loneliness and an inescapable erasure of his identity. One of the greatest challenges Sporus faced was Nero taking him all over the empire, not only for important events in Rome, but also to Greece, where Nero sought to participate in artistic competitions that he believed would prove his talent. There, Sporus was paraded as the Empress of Rome, displayed before guests and Greek nobility as a living portrait of a deceased woman. Although Sporus had to constantly play the role of Poppia in every situation, behind the makeup and lavish dresses, he knew he was nothing but a decoration, a plaything to satisfy Nero's delusions. The days spent in Greece were a constant torment, with Sporus forced to participate in festivals, performances, and competitions that Nero attended. All of it just another show in which Sporus could not escape. He had to perform the role of Nero's wife, a role with no end, a life that was never his choice. Every step, every gesture was under constant surveillance. He could not do anything without the watchful eye of Nero, always waiting for judgment and approval from the man who had turned him into a living tool for his madness. The suffering did not only come from Nero's control, but also from the indifference and coldness of those around him. While Nero and the Roman court required Sporus to play the role of a woman, to others he was just a victim, a manipulated object, a living thing with no autonomy. The feeling of being erased, treated as an object, only made Sporus more isolated and tormented. Sporus's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. He was no longer a free boy, but a shadow of himself, living in a world of illusions, never truly able to be who he wanted to be. The physical and mental changes he underwent were a total erasure of his identity, as all choices and personal autonomy were stripped away. Sporus's journey was not just a story of Nero's cruelty, it was a tale of oppression, pain, and loss. In a world full of power and manipulation, Sporus was a victim who could not escape, living a life controlled, manipulated, and pushed into a situation where there were no choices. He didn't just live in an invisible prison, but lived with an identity that was no longer his own, with no freedom, no hope, and no future. When Nero was finally overthrown in 68 AD, his collapse was not just the end of a reign, but also the end of a dark period in Sporus's life. After Nero's excessive actions and lack of self-control, rebellions began to erupt throughout the empire. The generals and provincial governors, unable to tolerate Nero's excesses any longer, led the revolt. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal security force, betrayed Nero, and the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Faced with pressure from all sides, Nero decided to flee Rome with a small group of loyal followers. Still, Sporus remained part of this chaotic world. Nero could not abandon his wife, even though she was just a shadow of Poppia. During the flight, Sporus accompanied Nero as an inseparable part of his life. However, Nero's downfall also meant that Sporus was no longer protected in a crumbling empire. When Nero eventually took his own life in 68, rather than face capture, Sporus found himself in an incredibly vulnerable position. With Nero gone, the Roman Empire no longer provided protection for Sporus. He became a living symbol of a brutal era, but also a valuable trophy that could easily be exploited. Sporus was now a possession for those who sought to seize power from Nero, and he continued to be used as a tool for political schemes. Sporus was taken over by the new emperors as part of the spoils of war. First by Nidius Sabinus, then Otho, and finally Vitellius, each treating him as a piece of power they had won. He continued to play the role of Nero's wife throughout this time, though he was no longer a symbol of power but a soulless object, completely devoid of agency. Finally, under the reign of Vitellius, Sporus faced his ultimate humiliation. Vitellius, a cruel new emperor, decided to use Sporus as a tool for public entertainment. He was put on display in violent reenactments and humiliating acts at the Colosseum, where he endured public mockery and abuse in front of thousands. This was the lowest point in Sporus's life, when his dignity and humanity were utterly destroyed, and he was reduced to a tool for brutal amusement. Unable to bear this final degradation, Sporus chose to end his life. Historical records suggest that he committed suicide, likely by poison, around 69 AD, at the young age of about 20. Sporus's death was not just the end of a young life, but a tragic reminder of what a person can endure under absolute power and unimaginable cruelty. Sporus's death was a heartbreaking tragedy, but it was also the final act he could control. In death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been stripped from him throughout his life: the power to decide his own fate. His story serves as a grim warning about the cruelty of unchecked power and the endurance of the human spirit under unrelenting oppression. The death of Sporus, though tragic and heartbreaking, was not only the end of a manipulated life, but also a profound reminder of the destructive power of absolute authority. Throughout his short life, Sporus was not just a victim of Nero, but a symbol of the suffering that humans can endure when power becomes a total corruption, turning vulnerable lives into tools for the delusions of those in control. Sporus's life is a dark lesson about the abuse of power, about how people can be erased, controlled, and brutally stripped of their dignity. Nero transformed Sporus from a person with his own identity into a living machine, a mere shadow of a dead woman, all to satisfy his twisted fantasies. This destruction was not just physical abuse, but a psychological erasure, as Sporus was forced to abandon everything, even himself. However, despite enduring unimaginable suffering, Sporus's death was also a final act of assertion, a declaration that, even when stripped of all agency, a person can still reclaim power over their fate, even at the cost of their life. Sporus's death, while it could not undo the pain he had suffered, was the one action he could control, a way to no longer be dominated by Nero's delusions. Sporus's story serves as a reminder of the cruelty that absolute power can inflict, of how one individual can be erased and stripped of all humanity under the manipulation of those in power. But it is also a lesson about the strength of resilience and the capacity for resistance, even under the harshest conditions. Sporus was not just a victim in an ancient Roman tragedy, but a symbol for all those who struggle to protect their identity and dignity in the face of brutal power. Sporus's story is not only a tragedy of a bygone era, but also an eternal reminder of the necessity for compassion, respect for human rights, and the actions we must take to ensure that no one suffers the kind of torment he endured in today's world.